Hale County, Alabama. Winter of 1879. A construction crew digging the foundation for a new courthouse struck something soft beneath the clay. At first they thought it was wood, an old casket maybe, until the soil began to breathe. When the sheriff arrived, the men had already unearthed a coffin lined not with satin but glass. Inside lay 12 tiny shapes, preserved as if time had stopped mid-inhale, and carved into the lid, in careful script, one impossible phrase: "Born of the barren." The records from that discovery were sealed within days. The names of the doctors, the midwife, even the parish, erased from every official ledger. But the journals that survived tell a story Alabama has tried to forget. A story of a woman who could not bear children, yet did. 12 times. Each birth stranger and darker than the last. Before we uncover the truth behind Margery Ann Kline and the 12 impossible births that defied every known law of nature, make sure you're subscribed and have the bell turned on. Tell us in the comments, which state are you listening from tonight? Now, let's return to 1849 Alabama. The earliest surviving reference to Margery Ann Kline appears in the Hale County Birth Ledger, 1849, where her name is noted as apprentice to midwife Clara Baines. She was 19 then, described in a census annotation as slight, pale, with the air of a woman older than her years. Hale County itself, at that time, was a tapestry of contradictions. Its red clay roads wound between fields of cotton and sorghum, its prosperity built upon bondage. The Civil War had not yet broken the horizon, and the small town of Greensboro was a place of both gentility and quiet cruelty. Wooden storefronts lined Main Street, the courthouse's white dome rising above them, while to the west lay scattered plantations with names that echoed Old English pride: Rosehaven, Millstone, Fair Hollow. Among them stood the modest clapboard cottage of Clara Baines, the county's most trusted midwife. She had delivered hundreds of children, black and white alike, and was rumored to possess a hand blessed by Providence. Margery Kline came into her service after the death of her mother, a seamstress whose sudden passing from lung fever left Margery without kin. Clara took her in not out of charity, but because she saw in the girl an unusual calm, the kind that could steady a birthing woman's terror. For 6 years, Margery followed Clara from farm to cabin, learning to mix pennyroyal tea, to read the pulse of a mother's wrist, and to judge by scent alone whether a wound had begun to rot. Her notebooks, later recovered from the Kline property, reveal an intelligence that bordered on obsessive. In careful ink she recorded not only herbal recipes, but the pulse counts, respiration, and body temperatures of mothers before and after birth. Details no other midwife of her time would have thought to measure. By 1855, Clara Baines had grown frail, her joints stiff with age. She formally named Margery as her successor, writing in her will, "To Margery Ann Kline, my tools, my scales, and my calling, for she alone bears the patience of the craft." When Clara died that winter, Hale County mourned, but none doubted that Margery would inherit her work. Yet something changed in her demeanor soon after. Witnesses, farm wives, servants, and a local physician, Dr. Elijah Morton, described her as quiet, almost reverent toward the blood itself. She began collecting more than was customary. Samples of afterbirth, discarded tissues, and stillborn infants she insisted upon burying herself in a plot behind her cottage. One neighbor, Mrs. Ruth Collier, testified in a church inquiry years later that she had seen lanterns burning in Margery's window till near sunrise, the smell of tincture and something iron-like in the air. Still, her reputation grew. Her success in complicated births earned her gratitude from the county's wealthiest families. In an era when medicine was still as likely to kill as to cure, Margery Kline's survival rate seemed almost divine. By the early 1860s, as Alabama drifted toward secession, Margery was considered an indispensable fixture of the county. She delivered the first child of Colonel Edmund Harker, the richest landowner in the region, and was rewarded with a parcel of land bordering his plantation. The deed, filed in February 1861, describes a small acreage with dwelling thereon, granted to Mistress Kline in gratitude for services rendered. The house she built there still stands, at least its stone foundation does. Local maps identify it as the Kline Homestead, situated on what is now County Road 7, a few miles north of Greensboro. In its day, it was considered peculiar, not the symmetrical Greek Revival style so common in plantation houses, but a square, window-heavy structure with narrow corridors and reinforced cellar doors. Neighbors noted that she lived alone, save for a single servant girl named Dinah, whose name later appears in parish burial lists from 1863. Cause of death, childbed fever. That same year, when the first Confederate regiments marched from Hale County, Margery Kline was 35 and unmarried. Her celibacy was the subject of whispered curiosity. Her patients spoke of her kindness, but men in town found her unsettling. Some claimed she wore a black veil even in daylight, others that she refused to enter a church since Clara's death. The war years brought hunger and fear, but Margery's practice only expanded. With doctors conscripted and hospitals overwhelmed, she became the only trained birth attendant for miles. Letters preserved in the Hale County Archive, Box 7, Folder 2, describe her walking through rain and mud to reach isolated cabins, sometimes returning days later, with eyes rimmed red and silence that chilled the room. It was during this period that the first records of her own pregnancies appear. A clerk's note from 1864 mentions Mrs. M. Kline's confinement expected come harvest. Yet no child was ever registered. Neighbors remembered hearing cries in the night, followed by days of mourning attire. Between 1864 and 1868, Margery is said to have conceived 3 times and lost each child before birth. In a later diary fragment she wrote, "A mother once and thrice bereaved. I have given and been refused. The Lord takes, but I have learned to give back in my own way." The close of the Civil War left Hale County in ruins, plantations burned, fortunes lost, and the courthouse records half destroyed by fire in April 1865. Amid this chaos, Margery Kline's standing did not falter. If anything, it solidified. She delivered the children of both freed women and destitute former masters. Her neutrality, rare for the era, made her seem saintly to some, suspicious to others. But it was around 1869 that her work took a darker turn. Several families reported uncanny details surrounding births she attended, infants born with faint marks on their wrists, identical to one another, mothers describing vivid dreams of a second voice speaking through Margery as they labored. The Morton Journal of Medicine, a local physician's log rediscovered in 1928, contains this entry dated May 17, 1870. Visited Mrs. James Collier at request. The midwife Kline had already delivered the infant, a female, healthy but unquiet. Found on the child's abdomen a bruise of circular form, faint but present. Midwife insisted it was birthmark, advised otherwise. Rumors spread, yet none dared accuse her openly. She had attended hundreds of births without formal fault, and in a small post-war town desperate for continuity, even whispers of witchcraft were tempered by gratitude for a living child. Her home, however, had become peculiar. Accounts from traveling peddlers describe shelves filled with glass jars, each labeled with dates and initials. She began purchasing large quantities of lye and spirits of ammonia from the general store, explaining that she was preserving herbs. One night in October 1871, a storm blew down part of her roof, and a neighboring farmer, Jonathan Pruitt, helped her repair it. In a deposition given years later, Pruitt claimed to have glimpsed through an open cellar door rows of small cribs covered in cloth, though the house held no child. He said nothing at the time. No one did. By 1875, Margery Kline was a name spoken in hushed awe throughout the county. Childless still, her fame grew paradoxically as a mother to all others. She kept records with a precision unmatched in the region, births, deaths, complications, and peculiar symbols beside some entries, small crosses or spirals that no one could decipher. A surviving page, reproduced in the Hale County Historical Review 1958, bears one such mark beside 12 names, each beginning with a different letter. The heading reads simply, "The Chosen, 1879. Her isolation deepened. She ceased attending church altogether, stopped visiting neighbors, and hired no new help after Dinah's death. The only voices heard from her home were her own, and occasionally, the wailing of women in childbirth." And yet, according to the birth records, no child was registered to any local mother between January and August of 1879, a strange silence in a county that typically recorded dozens of births per season. Something was happening behind those shuttered windows on County Road 7, something the townsfolk could not see or would not see. And when the first of the 12 impossible births was announced that autumn, even those who had once defended her began to wonder if Margery Kline's gift had not become a curse. In the spring of 1878, a new name appeared in the Hale County employment ledgers under domestic apprentices and servants. It read, Samuel Harlan, age 19, indentured aide to Mrs. M.A. Kline, midwife. Samuel was the son of a blacksmith from Marion, a neighboring town. His father had lost his forge in a flood and, desperate for stability, arranged for Samuel to work as a farmhand and courier. But by that year, most plantations were abandoned or bankrupt. The only one who offered him steady work was the strange midwife who lived alone on County Road 7. He began in June. Locals remembered him as polite, strong, and somewhat naive, a good lad with a sharp mind for fixing things. His duties were simple: tend the garden, fetch supplies, and keep the lanterns filled for Margery's long nights. He later wrote in a letter to his sister, Mary Harlan, dated June 21, 1878, Mrs. Kline pays fare and keeps to herself. The house is clean, though always cold. She treats the mothers kindly enough, but there is one locked room in the cellar she never lets me near. Says it's where she stores the tonics. The smell from it is strange, sweet and burnt all at once. In July, she began instructing him to deliver sealed parcels to the apothecary in Greensboro, each labelled in Latin. He did not question them, though one evening he opened a bundle out of curiosity and found inside a folded sheet of parchment covered in anatomical drawings. The figures were crude but unmistakable, fetuses in various stages of development, accompanied by notes in Margery's neat script. He said nothing, yet from that moment, unease took root in him. In late August, Samuel grew concerned when several women arrived at the cottage in secrecy, their carriages covered and lamps doused. None were from Hale County. They carried accents from the coast: Mobile, Montgomery, Selle, May. Margery told Samuel to fetch water and stay outside no matter what he heard, but on the night of August 29, 1878, he disobeyed. According to a fragment of his recovered notebook, now preserved in the Hale County Historical Museum, he wrote, heard the cry of a woman, then silence, went to the cellar steps, saw Mrs. Kline with her hands blooded, but the blood was wrong, thick, black, like tar. She spoke words I did not know, Latin maybe. When she saw me, she told me to fetch the linen. I saw a crib beside her, empty. She said the babe was lost, but I heard something move under the sheet. After that night, Margery grew oddly gentle toward him. She paid him more, offered him herbal teas that left his tongue numb. He continued his work, but began coughing and suffering bouts of dizziness. By October, his letters home changed tone. Mary, I am unwell, can't sleep. My hands tremble and my vision blurs. Mrs. Kline says it's swamp fever, but I don't recall being bit. My gums bleed when I brush my teeth. She gives me tincture that burns like spirits. I think she means to help, but I can't keep food down. Samuel's final weeks are known largely through a combination of oral accounts and the fragments of a journal he found hidden in her sewing chest. The same journal later recovered in 1956. He described sneaking into the cellar on November 12, 1878, when Margery had gone to deliver a child at the Harker plantation. Beneath a false floorboard, he found a wooden drawer filled with ledgers bound in oilskin. Inside were lists of names, initials, and notes in precise looping script. Subject M1, viable. Host deceased. Transfer successful. Subject C4, premature, requires strengthening compound. All to be presented by Easter 1879. The final entry he read before hearing her return said, "A womb may be borrowed as a seed may borrow soil. The Lord grants life. I have only learned his method." Panicked, he replaced the journal and pretended to be asleep when she entered. The next morning, Margery seemed unchanged. She even brought him soup and told him he'd worked too hard these past weeks. By November 20th, Samuel's condition had worsened dramatically. Neighbors later recalled seeing him stumble down the road toward town, his lips blue, eyes glassy. He collapsed outside the general store, muttering incoherently about the babies with no mothers. Dr. Elijah Morton examined him and recorded the symptoms in his medical log: severe tremor, numb extremities, slurred speech, discoloration of gums. He suspected mercury poisoning, though Samuel insisted he had taken nothing of the sort. When the doctor suggested hospitalization in Montgomery, Margery intervened. She claimed Samuel was delirious and that she would nurse him herself. Against protest, she took him back to her cottage. He was never seen alive again. 3 days later, on November 24th, Margery arrived at Dr. Morton's office with a written notice. "My assistant, Samuel Harlan, deceased of fever. Kindly prepare certificate." The doctor insisted on examining the body, but she refused, saying she had already laid him to rest on her property. This was not uncommon in rural Alabama, where private burials were frequent, but her haste raised suspicion. By December, townsfolk whispered openly that she had done away with the boy. When a constable finally visited the property in early 1879, he found the grave freshly sealed and marked only by a simple wooden cross. Margery offered tea and calm explanations. Her composure unsettled everyone. The constable's report, still preserved in county files, concludes, "How? See immaculate. Tools in order. No sign of violence. Subject Kline exhibits neither grief nor guilt. Claims boy died peacefully in sleep. Will not allow exhumation, citing religious reasons." That same month, she began making strange purchases: blankets, bassinets, and infant clothing in bulk. Her explanation: "I expect a fruitful spring." No one understood what she meant. In March 1879, church records note a curious event: the christening of an infant, Anna Ruth Kline, daughter of Margery Ann Kline. Witnesses swore they had never seen her pregnant, yet the child, pale, healthy, and quiet, was held in Margery's arms before the congregation of the small chapel on Magnolia Road. By May, another infant appeared, then another in June. Each time she presented a child to the local reverend for baptism, each bearing her name, each with identical pale eyes. When asked about the fathers, she simply said, "They are gifts." The Reverend Josiah Kettle recorded in his parish notes, "She claims miraculous conception. Town uneasy. Infants rarely cry. I feel a chill when near them. Each has a small bruised mark on the wrist, as if from cord or binding." Rumors spread that she had stolen the children from destitute women or from travelers passing through, but no missing infants were reported. Then, in August 1879, during a drought that withered the crops, the 11th and 12th births were announced within a week of each other. Neighbors saw smoke from her chimney day and night, and some claimed to hear scratching sounds from beneath the floorboards. When the constable returned, he found the house locked and the windows boarded. A sickly odor, sweet, metallic, hung in the air. Margery refused entry, saying the children were unwell from the heat. He filed no further reports. It was only after her own death in December 1879 that Samuel Harlan's story came to light. A letter he had written, never posted, was found tucked behind a loose board in her bedroom. It read in a trembling hand, "If any soul reads this, know that the babes are not born of her flesh. She takes from others, though I know not how. I have seen them before they breathe, and I have seen their mothers sleep in her cellar. She keeps a ledger of them all. She told me I was chosen to witness, to keep silent, but I cannot. My bones ache, my tongue burns. She said the tonic would make me still. I fear she means it so. The coroner who examined her body later, when the sealed records were reopened decades later, noted that no 12 children were found alive, nor any graves matching their names. But the cellar contained 12 small coffins, each empty, each lid scratched from within. The county coroner, Reverend Kettle, and 2 deputies investigated. They sealed the property and removed several boxes of evidence, journals, bottles, and unidentified remains. But within weeks, the courthouse fire of February 1880 destroyed the evidence logs. The investigation was closed under the entry, "Case concluded, natural causes." Local gossip faded with time. The Kline property was abandoned, later purchased by the Harker family, who demolished most of the structure. The cellar remained, filled and sealed. Only one surviving witness, an elderly washerwoman named Lydia May Collins, gave a deposition in 1891, recorded in the Birmingham Medical Quarterly. She testified, "I worked for Miss Kline once. She said the Lord spoke to her through the cries of unborn babes, said the world forgot what life owed her, and she meant to collect. She showed me a cradle with nothing in it but rags, moving on their own." The court dismissed her as senile. But her testimony, coupled with Samuel's letters, became the backbone of what researchers now call the Kline file, sealed until 1956. To this day, no official birth or death certificates exist for the 12 children of Margery Ann Kline. The ledgers recovered from her trunk in 1956 match Samuel's descriptions, 12 entries marked with initials, a column for host mother, and another for status. The last entry reads, "All delivered. The 13th awaits." No one knows what that means. But neighbors who later settled near the old Kline site reported strange occurrences. Faint crying at night, unearthed soil near the filled cellar, and a lingering scent of sweet herbs. Even now the foundation remains cold to the touch, though no vegetation grows upon it. And every year, on March 17th, the date of the first impossible birth, the local church bell rings 12 times at midnight, though the cord hangs broken. When the war's smoke had long since cleared and the Reconstruction years dulled the edge of memory, the Kline homestead stood like a relic of an older order, quiet, sealed, and slowly sinking into the red earth. But behind its boarded windows and beneath its sagging floorboards, something survived, not merely in dust, but in record. Among the documents preserved in the Hale County Courthouse before the 1873 flood, researchers found a small bundle marked simply, "Medical, Confidential." Inside were receipts written in Margery's precise hand, orders for chloroform, tincture of belladonna, morphine sulfate, and quantities of arsenic large enough to serve no domestic purpose. Yet all bore the counter-signature of Dr. Elijah Morton, the county's only licensed physician at the time. It seemed at first a clerical oddity, but when cross-referenced with Dr. Morton's own patient log, a pattern emerged, a series of stillbirths and fevers, all attended by the same small circle of women, wives of former plantation overseers and 2 freedwomen who had sought Margery's help after emancipation. Each case ended the same way, the mother's recovery delayed, the infant's life brief, and a burial conducted without clergy. Morton's descendants, when questioned a century later, insisted he had been a practical man for a desperate county. Perhaps he was. Yet the signatures on those slips of paper suggest more than practicality. They suggest partnership. The surviving testimonies from that decade paint an uneasy picture. Several townspeople later recalled being invited to the Kline property, not for births but for lessons. Midwives from as far as Perry County came to observe her methods. She spoke softly, they said, of balancing the humors, of using the infant's breath to strengthen the mother, of the necessary exchange between giver and vessel. Some left unsettled, others returned, eager to learn more. In the burned remnants of an 1877 ledger found beneath her house, its pages fused by moisture, there appears a list of names and numerals, 12 in total beside the heading Cycles Completed, next to each a single initial, D, E, H, L, and so on. The final entry is dated August 1879. It would take decades before anyone understood what those cycles meant. What historians later called the system began, it seems, as an obsession with equilibrium. Margery had convinced herself that birth and death must be balanced precisely, that the failure of her own womb was not a curse, but a sign that she was meant to mediate life for others. She began to time her deliveries with unnatural precision, inducing labor in one woman as another perished of fever miles away. To her, it was arithmetic, not murder. The complicity of her peers cannot be overstated. Dr. Morton's letters to the County Health Board, preserved only in fragments, describe experimental interventions under supervision of a local midwife of good repute. He never names her directly. In one letter dated March 3rd, 1878, he writes, "Subject 12 proceeding as predicted. The sequence of confinement and cessation holds. Recommend continuation." By then, Margery's small gatherings had evolved into something like ritual. She kept her apprentices ignorant of the larger plan, teaching only fragments of her techniques: how to control bleeding with pressure and salt, how to quiet a convulsing patient with laudanum until the breath itself slowed. She spoke often of those chosen to bridge the gap. The town, meanwhile, remained strangely silent. The sheriff, a man named Amos Grady, owed his position to the Harker family, whose plantation lay adjacent to the Kline property. When rumors began to circulate of infants gone missing and women driven strange after confinement, Grady dismissed them as superstition. He himself had called upon Margery after his wife's miscarriage in 1876, and whatever she did had restored his wife's strength within days. He owed her his gratitude and his silence. By the late 1870s, Margery's reputation reached the state capital. A traveling physician from Montgomery, Dr. Charles M. Yates, visited Hale County to observe her methods. His notes, uncovered in 1941, read, "The woman Kline displays knowledge beyond ordinary practice. Her insistence upon immediate burial of non-viable infants is questionable, yet executed with remarkable order. She speaks of a dozen births to come that shall close the circle." No official inquiry followed his visit. The county could ill afford scandal, and besides, the mortality rate among newborns in rural Alabama was so high that even 12 unexplained deaths raised little alarm. But one record, hidden within the 1880 federal census schedules, offers the clearest evidence that something systematic was at work. The enumerator for Hale County listed 12 children, born alive, none surviving, under households attended by the same midwife. When cross-checked with parish burial records, none of those children are named. It is as though they were never born at all. The cruelty of the system lay not only in the deaths themselves, but in the precision with which they were planned. Margery kept charts aligning lunar phases with gestation periods, noting in her margin calculations that tied each new conception to the anniversary of an earlier death. The 12 mothers, it seems, were chosen for their resemblance to her own lost childbearing, each one barren until Margery's intervention, each delivering after impossible intervals. Those who survived her attentions spoke little afterward. One woman, Mrs. Eliza Darnell, later confined to an asylum in Tuscaloosa, repeated the same phrase whenever questioned. "She took my dreaming from me." The child came in silence, and the silence stayed. By the time Margery's final patient died in late 1879, the county's population had dwindled from war, famine, and migration. Few remained who could or would accuse her, and those who might have spoken were themselves bound by her debt. Dr. Morton, indebted by his prescriptions, Sheriff Grady by his wife's recovery, and the Harker family by the safe birth of their heir. It was a perfect equilibrium of complicity. Later generations would call it coincidence, but the documents tell another story, a deliberate pattern of deaths masked as mercy, sustained by those who believed her a saint. What ended that pattern would not be conscience, it would be fear. The first true crack in the silence appeared in the summer of 1880, when a man named Samuel Tarrant arrived in Hale County, claiming to be collecting material for a medical journal in New Orleans. He was 31, well-spoken, and bore the self-assured air of a northerner who had seen too much war and too little peace. To the townsfolk, he introduced himself as a journalist interested in the changing practices of rural midwifery. In truth, his editor's letter had been little more than a pretext. Tarrant had received an anonymous parcel 2 months earlier, 12 slips of parchment, each marked with an infant's name and the initials M.K. at the bottom. He found Hale County wary of strangers. The war's bitterness had not yet cooled, and any man with a northern accent was regarded as an intruder. Still, curiosity served him. He rented a white whom at the Greensboro Inn kept a quiet profile and began interviewing residents under the guise of documenting folk medicine. Tarrant's curiosity became obsession. Over the next 3 weeks, he traced burial records, cross-checked midwife reports, and copied entries from the courthouse ledgers. What he found was statistical impossibility. In a county of fewer than 5,000 souls, 12 infants born within 8 months, all dying within a week of delivery, all attended by the same woman. Each burial fee had been paid in full by the same hand, Margery Kline's. On the 12th evening of his stay, he visited the Kline property. The house sat in silence, shutters fastened, its chimney dark against the dusk. He knocked and waited. After several minutes, the door opened a fraction, revealing a narrow face framed by a black shawl. "You are late for a birth," she said. When he introduced himself and explained his purpose, her expression did not change. "Men who write too much forget how to listen," she replied, and closed the door. That night, Tarrant wrote in his journal that her voice carried the calm of someone who no longer distinguishes between right and wrong. He resolved to return the next day with the sheriff, but by morning his room was empty, his papers scattered, and his horse found unsaddled near the river crossing. The innkeeper assumed he had left early. The sheriff did not investigate. No one in Hale County ever saw him again. A month later, a small satchel surfaced downstream, lodged in reeds by the Black Warrior River. Inside were 6 pages torn from a notebook, their ink nearly washed away. The legible words read, "The 12th mother confined, no infant visible, sounds below floorboards, iron sent." The handwriting matched Tarrant's. The satchel and its contents were logged as items of uncertain origin and placed in the courthouse archives, where they remained for nearly a century. After his disappearance, the county closed ranks. Rumors about Margery Kline were dismissed as blasphemy. Pastor Hughes of St. Paul's declared from the pulpit that gossip is the devil's handwriting, and those who spoke against her were quietly ostracized. When a deputy questioned Dr. Morton about the vanished journalist, the physician produced a ledger showing that Tarrant had purchased laudanum from him for insomnia. It was enough to end inquiry. Yet unease crept through the town in smaller ways. Mothers began refusing Margery's assistance, turning instead to untrained neighbors. Births increased again, but so did deaths. The sense grew that something had been stirred which would not settle. In letters preserved by the Morton family, the doctor confided that the woman Kline grows erratic, her hands shake when she writes, and she speaks of voices that call for balance. By the winter of 1881, Margery rarely left her house. Visitors reported the stench of chemicals, and at night lantern light flickered behind boarded windows. The sheriff claimed he could hear a rhythmic thudding like a pump or forge whenever he rode past after dark. No one knew what machinery could exist in a midwife's cellar. The county clerk recorded that she had imported from Mobile a shipment of lead piping and a hand-cranked air pump, items declared as medical apparatus. A farmer named Thomas Eldridge, whose wife had died in childbirth the previous spring, took it upon himself to confront her. He rode there one evening with a Bible in hand and a pistol hidden under his coat. What happened after remains uncertain. His horse returned alone the next morning, reins trailing. Eldridge's body was found a week later in a drainage ditch half a mile from the Kline property. The coroner ruled death by drowning. though the ditch was scarcely 2 feet deep. The local paper, the Greensboro Ledger, printed a brief notice. Mr. Thomas Eldridge perished tragically during recent floods. Mrs. Clinton, a respected nurse and midwife, assisted in the recovery of remains. No further mention appeared, and so the pattern continued: disappearance, silence, and official forgetfulness. By 1904, Hale County was quieter than it had ever been. The railway had moved west, taking with it the town's only reason for visitors to stop. Cotton prices fell. Families packed wagons and headed for Tuscaloosa or Birmingham. Those who stayed behind learned not to speak of the old days. It wasn't that they had forgotten, it was that memory had become a liability. One of the last people to handle Margery Kline's remaining documents was a county clerk named Thomas Dyer. He was 29 when he inherited the task of sorting through unshelved records from the 1880s. In a letter to his cousin, Dyer mentioned a series of midwife certifications written in 2 inks, as if signed twice by different hands. He noted that all 12 certificates from the year 1882 had been amended, dates corrected, signatures thickened, initials replaced. The same hand, he wrote, pretends to be 12. Weeks later, Dyer left Hale County without resignation or notice. His desk was found open, the drawer filled with scraps of copied handwriting, Margery's unmistakably. A colleague later swore that he saw Dyer boarding the night train carrying only a single parcel wrapped in newspaper. He was never heard from again. Not long after, the courthouse caught fire. The official report called it an accident caused by a fallen lamp, but the records that perished were all from a single section: births, deaths, and property transfers from 1878 to 1883, the precise years of the Kline events. The destruction of evidence did not erase the fear, it concentrated it. People spoke softly in church vestibules, in post offices, over fences at dusk. They said the soil on County Road 7 refused to hold water. They said that a faint crying could be heard there on nights when the moon hung low. They said the balance had not been satisfied. In 1911, the county board hired an inspector to survey the abandoned Kline property. His report, filed but never published, survives in a university archive. It reads like a confession. Cellar entrance collapsed. Within, several glass vessels intact, contents indeterminate. Found skeletal remains, infantile, in various stages of mineralization. 12 distinct, no sign of adult burial. Nearby, a wooden cradle bearing a carved M. Beneath cradle, a letter pressed flat by moisture, signed in faded ink. Dr. E. Morton, I have found the correct measure at last. Life restored but not returned. It lingers where it should not. The inspector added, recommend complete burning of site. Nothing good may come of excavation. The recommendation was followed. Yet burning did not bring closure. It brought contagion. What remains of the Kline system is neither science nor myth. It is administration. Records, forms, boxes labeled unclassified. No ghosts, no hauntings, just numbers that match too neatly, signatures that loop the same way across decades. That is how systems preserve their dead, not in blood or bones, but in routine. Paperwork is the most faithful grave of all. Today, the Hale County Courthouse stands rebuilt. The new archivists know nothing of what was lost, but if you were to open the oldest drawers, you might notice something strange. Every 12th birth certificate across more than a century bears a faint discoloration, an uneven stain like water or like something older, absorbed deep into the fiber. They say paper remembers what the mind chooses to forget. And if you listen long enough, in the hush of that archive room, you might hear it again, a thin, rhythmic sound, like the breath of someone asleep or something smaller, waiting to wake. By the spring of 1864, Hale County was collapsing under the weight of war and rumor. Men were gone to fight, the currency was worthless, and the countryside had turned to dust. The Kline homestead, what remained of it, stood behind a broken fence line, its shutters rattling in the warm wind like teeth in a skull. To most who passed by, it looked abandoned, but the ones who still whispered her name said otherwise. Margery Ann Kline had been declared dead twice, first by the coroner and later by the church, but death in Hale County was never an exact thing. It was a process, one that often waited for the right exchange. And in the year the war reached Alabama, something inside that house began again. The earliest report came from a Confederate deserter named Samuel Ricks. His statement was later found in a military file marked dismissed. He claimed that while hiding in the woods near the Kline property, he saw light moving behind the boarded windows. A kind of glow, steady as lantern flame but greenish, he wrote. Sounded like a child drawing breath, but deep. That same month, a farmer's daughter, 9 years old, disappeared while walking home from the river. Her footprints were found in the red mud halfway to the Kline place, then vanished. Searchers blamed the rain. But the girl's mother swore she heard crying on the wind for weeks after, from the direction of the house. By the end of the war, the Kline property had become a landmark of avoidance. Children were warned to stay away. Travelers quickened their pace on that stretch of road. And still, in 1866, the county issued a new midwife license under the name Margery Ann Kline, renewed by authority of Dr. Elias Morton, the doctor who'd supposedly signed her death certificate 8 years earlier. Dr. Morton himself was found dead that winter in his study, slumped across a ledger. The coroner listed apoplexy, but his eyes were open, mouth slightly parted, as if surprised by something standing in front of him. In his lap, the ledger was open to a final line. The measure must be balanced. After that, no one claimed to see Margery Kline alive again, but she had left too many records to truly vanish. In 1869, Hale County saw a sudden rise in unexplained infant deaths, 12 in total, spread across 6 plantations. Each occurred under a licensed midwife. Each mother reported the same phrase before she lost consciousness. She told me to breathe for 2. Doctors blamed fever, malnutrition, or maternal exhaustion. But one physician, Dr. Nathaniel Creed, quietly suspected otherwise. He had trained in Charleston before the war and had seen a single case like it before, a mother who claimed she could feel her child's heartbeat in her throat. He wrote, "These are not deaths by fever, but by exchange. Something is taken, something left behind." Creed began his own investigation, keeping private notes in a ledger bound in calfskin. He traced the midwives' records, the birth patterns, and the burial sites. The same signature appeared across multiple counties, sometimes full, sometimes reduced to a single initial, M.K. He took his findings to the county commission. They dismissed him as unstable, pointing to his use of laudanum. But a week later he vanished on his way to Montgomery. His horse was found by the roadside, reins torn, saddlebag emptied. The ledger was gone. Rumors thickened. Some said Margery had learned to prolong her life through a ritual of transference, that each birth renewed what time had taken. Others said she had never died at all, only changed form, passing from woman to woman through whispered instruction, a secret lineage of wombs. In the summer of 1873, when the courthouse burned for the first time, witnesses saw what they called lightning without the. The fire began in the records room, but not a spark touched the surrounding offices. Only the files tied to births, deaths, and land titles turned to ash. What happened that year remains pieced together from fragments, baptismal certificates, personal letters, and one surviving journal entry written by Sarah Ellen Harrow, a local nurse. She wrote of 12 births performed under Margery's supervision, though no record named her as present. The infants were born full term, but none cried immediately. Margery insisted each mother hold the child to her chest and breathe deeply, whispering a verse that began, "Let what is barren be made full." One by one the infants stirred to life. One by one the mothers fell silent. Sarah's final entry reads, "They were born, but not all of them living. Some part remains with her still." 2 weeks later, Sarah Harrow was dead. The coroner cited puerperal fever. Her personal effects included a handkerchief embroidered with 12 small crosses and one letter unopened addressed to the county doctor confidential. The envelope was empty. When the war's veterans returned to rebuild, they found the Kline estate abandoned again. The floors were blackened as though burned from within. In the cellar, the ground was soft and hollow-sounding underfoot. Men who went down there reported hearing faint scratching, like something trying to move through earth. One man, A freedman named Henry Tabb claimed he saw small impressions in the soil, as if made by hands too small to be born yet. The site was quietly filled in and left unmarked. Decades passed, but the pattern refused to die. Every 12 years, in or around Hale County, a cluster of deaths or disappearances occurred. Always 12. The victims changed, sometimes mothers, sometimes infants, sometimes those who tried to investigate, but the rhythm held. It reached a crescendo in 1901 when a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Burley held a revival near Greensboro. In his sermons he railed against the covenant of the barren woman and accused the local elders of concealing unnatural births. His sermons drew crowds. Then suddenly he stopped appearing. The tent remained pitched for 3 weeks, flapping in the wind, pulpit still standing. On its surface, carved with something sharp, were the words, "The balance is met." What happened to Margery herself remains uncertain. Some said she drowned in her own cistern, her body unrecognizable. Others insisted she lived under another name, tending births in neighboring counties until age finally betrayed her. One account claims her remains were discovered in 1880, perfectly preserved, eyes open, hair ungray. The coroner refused to sign the certificate, writing only, "She has not expired, she has completed." Whether she was human or something else, a vessel, a force, or a hunger-given form, Hale County never agreed. But her pattern, her system, as later historians would call it, proved stronger than her name. It passed through generations, hidden in bureaucracy and superstition, buried beneath births and deaths that never matched. By the 1970s, when researchers returned to the courthouse to digitize old records, one clerk noticed that every 12th file refused to scan properly. The images appeared blurred, overexposed, or blank. No explanation satisfied the technicians. The clerk, perhaps out of dark humor, wrote a note in the margin. "System error." The term stayed. And so, when modern historians speak of the Kline system, they refer not only to the woman's impossible acts, but to the quiet, persistent mechanism that kept her story hidden, the self-correcting silence of a community that forgets by design. Even now, the land where her house once stood remains fenced, untended, marked by a single dead tree. Locals say that on certain humid nights, the air turns heavy, and if you listen carefully, you can hear the faint sound of breathing beneath the soil. No one has ever built there again. And when archivists handle the 12 baptismal records from 1879, those found sealed in the iron trunk, they report a strange warmth. By the time Dr. Marcus Hale found the name Margery Ann Kline, he had already forgotten why he started looking. He was an archivist by profession, a man of records, not of belief. He'd spent his career sifting through fragments of other people's lives, tracing patterns of bureaucracy and decay, but the Kline file was different. It wasn't part of any collection he knew. It appeared one afternoon inside a mislabeled batch from the Alabama State Archives. A single birth certificate from 1879 marked revised, its margins pale with age, its ink faded to the color of dried rust. The mother's name was recorded as various. The infant's name was illegible, and in the remarks column, a small note in pencil, "See Hale County case." That was all, but it was enough. Marcus had spent years studying what he called genealogical recursion, the way historical errors replicated themselves like viruses through databases, slowly becoming indistinguishable from truth. But the Kline record didn't feel like an error. It felt intentional, like a breadcrumb placed in time for someone to find. He told himself he was following the trail for academic reasons, but he knew better. In the fall of 2018, he drove to Hale County, Alabama, a place that seemed both alive and asleep. The courthouse stood in the town square like a preserved organ, still pulsing faintly. The air smelled of dust and pine sap. Inside, the county archivist, a soft-spoken woman with silver hair, listened as Marcus explained his request. When he mentioned the name Kline, her eyes flickered, a reaction she quickly buried beneath politeness. She left him waiting in a small reading room lined with brittle ledgers. When she returned, She carried a thin folder bound with twine. "These are all we have," she said. Inside were 12 baptismal records, each dated differently but written in the same hand. Every page bore a dark circular stain where the ink had spread and thinned, like something organic bleeding through. He turned one over. The backside was damp, though the air in the room was dry. "Where did these come from?" Marcus asked. The archivist hesitated. "They were found behind a wall in the courthouse during renovations back in 1954. We don't usually bring them out." Marcus asked why not. "Because sometimes," she said softly, "they come back changed." He thought she was joking. But that night in his motel room, he noticed something strange. The folder he'd copied the documents into had 13 pages, not 12. The last was blank except for a faint watermark, the outline of a child's hand. He didn't sleep. On the second day, he went to see what locals called the Kline property. The directions were half lost in memory and rumor, but an old woman outside the hardware store pointed him the way. "You'll know it when you feel it," she said. The road narrowed until it was little more than a path through overgrown kudzu. What remained of the property was not a house, but an impression. A depression in the earth, surrounded by trees that leaned inward as if listening. At the center stood a great split oak, hollow but still alive. The soil beneath it was unnaturally pale, almost white, as if something had burned there and refused to heal. Marcus knelt, brushing away leaves. Beneath the roots, he found glass shards embedded in the dirt, remnants of jars or bottles, each clouded with residue. One still carried a partial label, "tincture of," but the rest had been eaten by time. He took a photograph. The light around him dimmed slightly, though no clouds passed. He heard what sounded like whispering. Not words, just breath moving through leaves. When he checked his phone later, the photo was blurred, the tree stretched thin as if it were moving. He told himself it was the wind. That night, Marcus listened back to his courthouse recordings. Beneath the archivist's voice, he caught a faint tapping. 12 rhythmic beats. Pause. 12 again. In the following weeks, Marcus catalogued everything he had found. He built digital folders, transcribed audio, and scanned documents, but the files refused to stay still. One by one, they corrupted, replaced with blank icons or fragments of static. He started printing the records instead, sealing them in envelopes. Yet even the paper began to change. One morning, he found a reddish stain spreading from the center of a page, forming concentric rings like growth lines on a tree. He didn't mention it to anyone. He simply moved his work to analog, notebooks, photographs, and printed transcripts pinned to a corkboard. But the more he arranged them, the more he noticed a pattern. Each document carried the same date in different centuries: 1879, 1979, 2019. He began to suspect the haunting wasn't of a place or a person, but of time itself, an infection that reappeared every 100 years, always in 12 instances, always ending with a 13th. He called it the System of 13. One evening, Marcus received an email from a genealogy researcher in Tuscaloosa. She had seen his public query about the Kline lineage and claimed to have found something you'll want to see. Attached was a scan of a birth certificate from 1979, 100 years after the first Kline record. The infant's name was redacted, the attending midwife's name was typed, then overwritten faintly in pencil. M. Hale Kline. The mother had died during delivery. Cause: cerebral hemorrhage. The child had lived. Adopted. No further record. The researcher added that oddly the certificate had been corrected multiple times by different clerks, as though no one could agree on its authenticity. Marcus replied, asking for contact details of the surviving family, but the email bounced back undeliverable. Within a week, the sender's address no longer existed. He stopped sleeping for more than an hour. It's a time. When he closed his eyes, he saw pages turning, each with the same name written over and over until it blurred into pattern. He began hearing that 12-beat rhythm again, faintly from within the walls of his apartment, the hum of his computer fan, even the ticking of the kitchen clock. Marcus was never seen in Hale County again. 2 months later, his department received a box containing his research notes, mailed from an address that didn't exist. Inside were 12 sealed envelopes. Each bore the name of a student who had once studied under him. The 13th envelope was unmarked. The department opened one at random. Inside was a single photograph, a hollow oak tree, half buried in white soil. At its base, a faint red stain spread outward like roots. No one opened the remaining envelopes. They were archived, then misplaced, then eventually lost. Every few years, someone mentions the Hale County files, usually a new researcher who finds the reference in some forgotten database. The same note always appears beside it. See Hale County case. They follow the lead, visit the courthouse, speak to the archivist. The 12 records are always there. The air in the reading room always smells faintly of ash and salt, and in every instance, one record more than before. Those who look too closely report hearing a soft, steady tapping. 12 beats. Pause. 12 again. No one can say what happens after that. The accounts end abruptly. Files deleted, research abandoned, correspondence unanswered. Locals say that if you visit the Kline field in late October when the moon is low and the wind moves slow through the hollow oak, you might see a figure standing just beyond the pale soil. Sometimes she looks like a woman in a dark dress, sometimes like a man in a long coat, but if you look too long, she begins to look like you, and when you blink she's gone, but the sound remains. 12 slow beats, one after the other, fading into the rhythm of your own pulse.